So I'm really delighted to invite Anna tonight in celebration of her new book, and also in celebration of the concept and the practical ideas of the Forager's garden. So Anna is a trained horticulturist and a permaculture teacher and designer, and she's grown up in cities all over the world and has a deep love of plants, and like me many years ago became fascinated with what is called the doctrine of signatures, which is all about how plants display their characteristics and their abilities through how they look. And that's always fascinated me. Like belladonna looks like a dilated pupil, for example. Plants display this fascinating intelligence. Anna spent many years as a community gardener in North London, designing gardens and planting fruit trees, teaching people all about food growing and becoming more resilient. And now she's based in Hastings, where she is still a community gardener and has a small urban foragers garden and also a larger field. So you're used to gardening and cultivation on lots of different scales. But tonight we're going to talk about very specifically the forager's garden. So my first question tonight is a really basic one, and that is, tell us a little bit, what is a forager's garden? Over to you, Anna.
Cheers, Maddie. A forager's garden is a garden where we've got this really dynamic relationship between gardening and cooking, jumping out into the garden to collect something to add it to our dishes. And our kind of raison d'etre of the garden are the things that we're going to eat. So I always advise that we sort of start off in a dream state, thinking about all of those foods. And really, I mean, a forager's garden is like an ode to the forest garden, but I really wanted to make this easier for people to come on board and start to do that for themselves. You know, a lot of the food that we have, I don't know, in my book, it's not real food. I think that we've got a generation that have grown up with food that is quite toxic, and there's a lot of food miles and it's not as fresh as it could be. But like, what better than to just go out into the garden and get really fresh, healthy food? So I think it is about the bigger picture of also connecting to our food and knowing where it comes from. Like, you know, it's a bit of a cliche, but I worked in a lot of schools and children don't know where food comes from, things like milk and vegetables. And I think, you know, it's just such a basic need, and we've lost this connection to our food. So I think in the bigger picture of like seeing gardens as really significant, even if we're just getting quality, not quantity, it's really important that we grow our own food, and that it's easy for us to do that.
So tell us a little bit about, a typical harvest at this time of year from your garden. What, this is a time when not a lot is happening, but what can you find out there for your kitchen?
Well, actually, I think there's a lot happening out there. I'm like this. I'm looking at the hairy bittercress that I allow to be in the garden. I'm looking at my garlic mustard coming up. There's all the nettles that are going to come to make nettle tea, a great thing to have in spring to sort of detoxify the body after winter. It's really an exciting time because there's just going to be so much to eat. And it was a real revelation about some of the leaves that we can eat, such as the bittercress. I mean, it tastes absolutely delicious. And then there's the sorrel. I mean, don't even get me started on sorrel. It's just like spinach, but from heaven. And so what's exciting about now is a lot of these leaves, they're quite ephemeral and they're only really got quite a short season. dandelion leaves included. And so it's really exciting time just to sort of make the most of that and go out and gather them when they're young and tasty.
So really, you're talking about, on one level, eating your weeds, or the
Yeah.
Elizabethan salad that Robert Hart, pioneer of forest gardening, wrote and taught so much about. But there are other levels to the forest garden, the forager's garden out there,
Yeah.
that you're planting up. Tell me a little bit about the structure.
There's these layers in the garden. There's these multi-dimensional layers um, that form the most part of the structure. Obviously, things like trees and shrubs are the actual structure. And so we're kind of becoming aware in our garden of all of the layers. But then for me, because as well as the doctrine of signatures, when I found out about guilds, I was just like so in love with that concept. And I've been gardening with that concept for 10, 11, 12 years now. And it's like when you get a guild right, you can see the happiness in a plant. It's just so dynamic. And so it's this kind of marriage between the layers and then the guild structures. And so what I'm doing in the book as well is saying, include all your wildflowers if they are in the layers or the guilds.
Tell me what a guild is and how you garden with guilds.
So a guild is like it's like a mini ecosystem that you're putting around a key plant. So typically imagine like an apple tree and then having things like garlic around it or comfrey around it. So garlic would be like an insect repellent, and comfrey is this thing called a dynamic accumulator, which it's really conceptual. It's like a really deep taproot that mines nutrients from deeper into the soil profile, and then in its leaves delivers these nutrients which you then put onto the soil and you turn it back sort of more available to the plants. So then there's like ground cover, which helps you exclude weeds. Then there's nitrogen fixers, which helps you improve the soil again. And then there's umbellifers, which are like sort of pollinator attractors extraordinaire. They just seem to really, the bugs just love them. And then there's like your classic sort of nectar giving flowers that are insect attractors. And so what I began to notice is really what we're doing is like growing our own fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides. So it's really organic, and I'm always seeking to garden organically. So in short, it's those two things crossed over.
Okay, so you're looking at your planting in terms of complementary collections, effectively.
Yeah,
Where did the idea first come to you
about
about
the
the
foragers.
forager's garden? Yeah, tell me about that, the genesis of it.
Well, it is a progression of which it's culminated in this term quite recently. But in short, I used to teach food growing by seed workshops all over North London. And at the same time, I was developing a lot of forest gardens. So you're like speaking to the biggest fan of forest gardening. I absolutely love it. And it really works for me. And it works, I think, in many situations because it's low maintenance and it's ever increasing. And you make this happy ecosystem. And so, I was much more interested to teach about that. And I was playing around with some workshops in Hastings, and like everyone's like really stumbling on the word forest because it does conjure up kind of big trees and big spaces that you need. And really, I'm like an urban gardener. Like I was really big into urban agriculture, and I just sort of tweaked it to forage, and then it was like a eureka moment because this is what we're doing. We're creating these lifestyles where we can go out and gather from our gardens. And it's not that permaculture is kind of nerdy, it's just that to understand forest gardening, you have to know the theory behind it, which is that you're imitating a forest. And so it just came to me that actually we're foraging, we're creating gardens to forage from, and it's much easier to immediately relate to that. And because like the ultimate aim is to get everyone gardening in this way, you know, each small to large spaces. And so I just thought that that terminology would really help people connect.
So give me a couple of examples of a forager's garden. Give me a tiny one first.
We used to do a lot of kind of window box gardens in Old Street in London, and there was some, you know, like Den of Iniquity drinking club that asked us to do loads of sort of romantic sort of wild plantings. So we did like a little olive in a window box with some lovely beautiful herbs and, you know, like sage and a bit of rosemary, and, you know, basically got as many of the layers that we could do and guilds into a small place, which sort of raises that you don't need absolutely everything, and you can use small trees. You know, you don't have to like do a massive standard fruit tree, but yeah, you can do it on any level. And then, you know, just now on my field, I've got like 3 or 4 foragers gardens that I'm developing, and they're much more tree based and shrub based because I've got like rabbits and things like that. So, you know, it's different sort of priorities of plants according to your situation.
But I mean, it's an ideal system for a small urban garden where you've got limited space. You can't have, you know, too many massive trees casting shade. So you want to grow the ground cover, the self-seeding salads, the herbs, and small shrubs and soft fruit, but you don't necessarily want to be trying to cram in a conventional organic garden of annual plants because you just haven't got the space.
It's space issues, yeah, but it's also time, I think, you
Yeah.
know, and it's also like um, it's easier to plant a fruit bush and water it than to sort of start off all your veg at the right time of year by seed and pot it on and blah blah blah, you know. And it's like it's kind of passive food growing in the sense of it gets on and grows itself, and it just is ever increasing. So I think in an urban situation, but also like a modern situation, it really comes into its own. And the thing is, if you've got nothing in your garden, but then you have like a small miniature peach tree with peach blossom and a couple of peaches, that's like really deeply profound and connecting, particularly in a lifestyle where you wouldn't be getting that. So I just think, you know, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to do the whole shebang, but just to start putting in and getting to know your food plants. And also the quality of taste is just, it's like sublime, rather than, you know, imagine going out into your garden and just gathering like some nigella seeds and putting that on a loaf of bread. I mean, that is like transformational food and cooking, but you couldn't go out and find that freshness or that quality of taste just down the shop, for example.
So if someone was just starting out, they've just moved somewhere, they've got a garden that's been neglected for ages, it's a typical sort of urban garden with not a lot in it. What are the beginning places for planning and planting a garden? What do you recommend for total novices? To how do they get started?
I mean, I think the most logical thing to do is to try and find one plant of each category. Do you know what I mean? So just like you start off with a tree, and if it's urban, if you're renting, if it's a small garden, there's so many like smaller trees you can get to grow in pots. So I just say, you know, very first baby step, get a small patio tree and put it in a pot, and then sort of start planting things underneath it. and just watch them grow. And you'll want to do like the next thing. You'll be like, well, where can I put some raspberries? And you'll like stick them up the fence, and just get started, you know, step by step. Because the thing is, this is a really incremental approach as well. It's not like you have this magic wand and you've like designed it all from the start and everything's going in straight away. It's just, you know, one or two things at a time within each season, and just literally watch it grow.
What about herbs? Because people love growing herbs, don't they? Both culinary and herb teas as well.
Yeah, it's like, even, you know, it's more and more and more and more popular. And there's so many herbs you can, I mean, that's what I fell in love with. I did a herbal medicine degree when I was 24. And like you, fell in love with the doctrine of signatures. I was like, wow, I didn't even know these plants could do all this. And I've still got all of my books. And I would just read through herbals like for hours on end. And trust me, there's so many things you can make tea out of, and like medicines, home medicines. And you know, and as for culinary herbs, it's like the world's your oyster. And now we've got kind of windowsills and little polytunnels. We can like expand the herbs that we can grow.
Yeah, and also in an urban situation, you often have the advantage of a microclimate. You know, cities are warmer than rural gardens, and they've often got lots of, you know, they can suffer from shade, city gardens, but they've also got walls for espaliering plants and growing plants up, and they can often be very, very sheltered. So what you can grow in a small city garden, you mentioned coriander, you'd struggle to possibly grow in my garden, which is a bit open to the wind and a bit,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, I remember because I lived in Camden, and there was a lot of Greek Cypriots, and you know, and you'd sort of walk past all these front gardens, and you knew um, where like people that were still connected with their food. And I would like hark after that, because they'd have like big verandas in their front gardens. You have to walk under the grapes to get to the front door.
That leads me on to this wider vision that you have, and the reason why you did call it a forager's garden, because you want people to plant these semi-natural food systems and organic systems, so that it takes the stress out of going out into nature and foraging, you know.
That's like a sort of subsidiary part of the book. I really wanted loads of people to use the permaculture system of forest gardening. And because it's all about food, it's that dynamic relationship. But, you know, I'm not anti-foraging at all. I love going foraging. The garlic's about to be ready. Everyone's getting really excited about that where I live. Um, and it's not you know, it's just that actually I love those plants so much, those plants that we go out and forage. Why don't we bring them into our garden?
Yeah.
And instead of, you know, because if we all, because it is getting more popular, but if we all go out there and forage, it's going to be like the locusts just kind of getting all the plants. But actually we can sort of consciously avoid all of that. And, you know, some of the things that we forage will love to be in a garden.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of wild garlic. We have loads of wild garlic in the woods, and at the moment, um, most of my local community haven't discovered the joys of, you know, making pesto with wild garlic and using it in cooking. So there's no stress on the wild population. So I've seeded it all over my garden, and it is fantastic ground cover. It isn't horrendously invasive as a plant. It's got beautiful flowers, and it has this incredible, you know, you're talking about taste, it has this wonderful vigor at this time of year, where you see these lovely green leaves and shoots coming up, and you know that you've got the promise of white flowers coming
Oh
soon.
yeah.
So and again, they've got that kind of form that is like almost like an umbilife for, and so insects like them as well, so that you win with all of them.
What the plants you use are totally, you know, within your climate zone, and you can find plants for all of these categories that we're talking about. And it's such an opportunity to get to know your local plants. And part of the book is really about protecting nature and turning weeds into harvest. And there'll be so many stories of species lost wherever you are in the world, and basically gardens can be part of that solution. They can help to conserve, and we can see them as small little weeds, and we can nourish them into being and make sure that they set seed and come back again. In my project in Hornshurst, what I've really tried to do is be quite sort of native varieties and indigenous plants. So but if you've got enough light, then plant a fruit tree, but the obvious thing to go for is like an apple, or pears or something. And then there's like dog rose. This is really native. That can be like a vine. We've got hops, loads of the sort of British herbs like mints and melissa, and anything. Basically in gardens you just have to know, is it shade loving or is it sun loving, what are my basic conditions, and then find the plants that match it. So if it's a garden, I think you can go a bit more off-piste and try some sort of interesting varieties. But I do think that if you're much nearer nature, then we've got to be mindful to sort of keep it quite sort of native varieties.
It's about looking at what are your local nurseries selling, and what thrives in your locality, if we're going to use cultivars, and then what's thriving in nature around you, and what do you like to eat. That's the other
Exactly.
thing.
First,
Yeah.
that's the first question.
So that's what I did with my garden. I garden on chalk, which is incredibly challenging for fruit trees, because there's not much fertility. So like you, I plant comfrey guilds around them, and marjoram, because marjoram loves chalk. So that Mediterranean dry landscape suits my garden. But I also plant loads and loads of chalk downland flowers, because they thrive, and they're beautiful, and some are edible, but some aren't. Some are just purely for all the reasons that you gave, that they are natural. They attract pest predators, and they keep the organic balance. And I've never had codling moth because I have bats. So you've been involved in Transition Town, you've worked in London in all sorts of community gardens, and now you're on the South Coast, and you've studied permaculture, and you've kind of integrated that. So just a little bit of celebration of permaculture. What for you is one piece of permaculture wisdom, or a technique or practice that stays with you, and that you use with regularity in your work, as a gardener and a garden designer?
Really, it's the thing of waiting a year. I mean, I know it's really hard to do that when you've like moved into a house and you're really excited. And I just know now from personal experience, if you don't wait a year, you will end up spending money and putting something expensive in a place that you wish you hadn't. So like an example is, I moved to the suburbs in London, and I was like, I've got to do food up front. I've got to do like a veg growing garden outside. I had like a green roof on my bins, and I had loads of like containers to grow in. And then I realized that I really needed a bike shed, in that spot. And it was like, so, there's some page one mistakes. Again, I moved to the field, and I was like concerned about light, and I was just sitting on my hands to try and not do something for a year. And because it really pays to do that, and I'll tell you why in a second. But the things like, I got a tree surgeon in to cut some hedging down, and that wood is just still lying there. We haven't used it, we haven't moved it. It didn't make a blind bit of difference to the hedge, but it cost £400. So there's things like that. But also, so when you do that thing of sector planning, and you wait a year, and you see your garden in every season, and you see where the light falls in winter, it makes such a big difference to the success of your garden. And so, for example, where I sited my orchard, literally on some days there's a line, and underneath it is the sun and the fruit trees, and above it is shade. And like, I really appreciate the wisdom of that, because it just, we're living in a society that's in such a rush. But actually, with gardens and plants and trees and growing things and life, actually, we don't need to be rushing all the time, and it definitely pays to wait. So that's one that I love. Another one, or like a defining moment, was slow and small solutions. So when I heard that, because I would normally just rush in and do big things quickly. So it's a bit like why I appreciate the waiting a year, but it's also like, actually do small changes and do like the smallest thing to the greatest effect. I think that's really profound as well. It doesn't have to be showy, but just a really small effective thing. And it's, within ecological gardening, leaving a seed head on a flower so that, birds can get fed in the winter. That's such a small thing, but it's really a big thing for nature. So I think, yeah, the small things are to be appreciated.
Yeah, we've really noticed that with our goldfinch population, that it's very tempting to cut our wildflower meadow and mulch with it and keep it all in order and ready for the next year. But we've deliberately kept patches of seed heads around the garden, and we've just watched over the years the goldfinch population rise and rise and rise every year, so that one or two have turned into 20 or even flocks of 30 now, and they're joyous,
Amazing.
beautiful birds. So
And you helped do that. Do you know what I
yeah,
mean? You helped do that, and it didn't take much.
they are.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit, what was your aim? Why did you sort of put yourself out there and went through the process of writing a book, coming in from the garden and picking up your, not exactly, well, your figurative pen? What was the aim?
The aim was to help people do this at home, and to make it easy. Like, I had 3 writing mantra words, which aren't like the most exciting words, but this is a non-fiction book. So that was clear, possible, and useful. I worked with so many adults, so many children, teaching them about food and food growing and gardening. And we just, it's not our faults. We live in this culture that hasn't taught us, hasn't prepared us for this. And I just wanted to make it really accessible for people, so that they would just read that and go, I can do that. And as well, to sort of, this is not, it's a permaculture gardening book, but it's not written for permaculture people. It's written so that you can do bits of permaculture without sort of knowing very much about it. In fact, you don't even really have to mention the word. It's just a very ecological way of gardening. And, it's for a generation maybe that don't want to double dig and use chemicals and all, that kind of 50s gardening that we've probably grown up with. It's for like a new generation of gardeners who are like, okay, I want to do that. I want to restore the soil. I want to know how to mulch and make compost. And so the book is like giving people all of those techniques that you need to know, like in an overview, so that if you're doing this type of gardening, these are your methods that you need to be aware of. And it's a different set of methods as, ornamental herbaceous borders. And so I'd kind of, had this idea to sort of make a short, snappy book to make forest gardening really easy for people to do. And then when the pandemic hit, it was like watching everybody really wanting to know how to garden. And it was like, wow. And so what I tried to do is just like anticipate what people would need to know, to sort of to keep this momentum going with people being in their gardens. The book that I really wanted to write is like chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9, and maybe the introduction. And that's like the heart of the book. And then wrapped around it is like this blanket of like, here's how you do gardening. Here's what you need to know. And then again, it's like, here's what is useful given that we've had this pandemic. how can we think about our gardens as being useful spaces in terms of local food? And just, you know, because like a forager's garden is really good for community gardens in schools, it's low maintenance, ever increasing. How can we get like food legacies everywhere? Um, and, you know, and so there is a sort of serious local food blanket wrapped around it.
What I love about the book is it's got vibrant images in it, and they're of the gardens that you've planted, and they're in different situations. You know, there are the bigger community gardens as well as the small urban sites, and I just felt like it's really important to show those, because this isn't a theory, this isn't a book about something that someone's done for a year or so as an experiment. This is a whole, you know, don't want to say how long, but you know, it's a whole process that's evolved from your life experience over time. But
Yeah.
thank you very much, Anna. It's been really brilliant to talk to you. Of course, if you want to buy the book, Anna has a website.
It's on Permaculture online, or it's on Analog Permaculture.
And you can have a good old rootle around your website and see some of the pictures and enjoy the aesthetics of that website. I like your website very much. You can also go to Permaculture shop, and find it on our website as well. And we always say, when you buy direct from the small independent publisher, or indeed the author, it's like buying local food in your local market.